Welcome to Lighter Than Air Flight Magazine. Let's explore stories and discoveries from the exciting and adventurous world of lighter than air aviation. Today, my guests are William Armstrong and Michael Emmick. Both are celebrated balloonists who fly hot air balloons and gas balloons. They have received many ballooning awards and honors for their flying feats, and they've also been on support teams of major ballooning attempts across the Atlantic and around the world. Michael Emmick has flown with many ballooning pioneers and has been the president of the National Lighter Than Air Society. He has also served as a chairman of the Balloon Federation of America's Gas Balloon Division, and he has been building hot air balloons since the 1970s. William Armstrong has been the director and vice president of the Balloon Federation of America. Both were members of the Balloon Flyers of Akron, which was the largest and most active gas ballooning club in America. I will be talking with them about their book, Hands Off, which is about the epic adventures of the Balloon Flyers of Akron. It tells the story of how a small group of dedicated balloonists and blimp pilots helped revive the sport of gas ballooning in America starting in the 1950s. Congratulations to both of you.
Thank you, Sitara. Thank you.
Thank you, Sitara.
Sure. And welcome to Lighter Than Air Flight Magazine. Now, when I read your book, I was fascinated by the thorough research and the adventures of gas balloonists. While writing this book, you reflected on the learning experiences of early Goodyear and Navy aeronauts. I know that both of you are passionate balloonists, but writing a book about American gas ballooning is a different matter. So what inspired you to write Hands Off, and what does the phrase hands off mean in ballooning?
Well, I'll give you the second answer first, if you like. You know, what does the title mean? A lot of people have asked us, what does that mean? And it's very simple. In the moments before a takeoff, a gas balloon is finely balanced between rising and falling. Pilots can test a balloon's buoyancy by telling the ground crew to put their hands on the basket railing and just hold on as they take on sandbags or take off sandbags. Then they're pretty much ready. We spill half a bag of sand over the side until the balloon begins to float. Now, even disposing of a handful of ballast will cause a balloon that's perfectly balanced to become light enough to ascend. Anyway, when the pilot's ready to fly, we issue the time-honored and traditional command, hands off. At that point, the crew removes their hands from the basket and the magical journey of a gas balloon begins. So our book, Hands Off, tells about the magical journeys on epic adventures of the Balloon Flyers of Akron.
And what inspired you to write the book?
Sitara, Bill and I have been friends for over 40 years, and we are the last standing members of the Balloon Flyers of Akron. And we had concerns, especially with the virus, and over the past couple of years, as we were losing members, that we need to write down some of these memories and document some things. It's a niche history. The general public would be interested in it, but especially the balloonists, the younger people, would never know we existed if we didn't write some of this down and document it. We had kept uncovering photos from estates. Bill and I both have lots of photos, but they're in boxes in the basement and in our libraries. So we wanted to share these with the ballooning community while we're still able to do that and not lose this history to when we're gone, it's gone. So we decided to write something down. We started out with, we thought we would come up at least with a booklet, maybe 100 pages or so. And then after that, we kept turning over more and more stories and looking through archives. And lo and behold, we have 342 pages.
Wow. So when, where and how does the story of the revival of gas ballooning in America begin?
So I guess the revival of gas ballooning as a sport would begin right after World War II. The Navy was still using balloons to train blimp pilots, as we said before, but a bunch of guys from Goodyear got together to try to preserve some of this heritage. And they formed a study club called the Wingfoot Light of the Nair Society, and they were able to then get access to surplus Navy training gas balloons, some small balloons, a couple of balloons that were of racing size. And they began to put together a program to inflate them and restore them and fly them. The 5 or 6 guys who did this were our mentors. A guy named Roger Walcott, Jim Cantos, Art Swanson, and Don Overs. They brought other people into the club, but they also needed to get training for themselves. So they asked the old Goodyear and Navy blimp pilots to conduct a training program for them. And they basically duplicated the old Navy training syllabus, the same kind of thing that Mike and I duplicated in the 1980s when we began our lessons.
Okay. Now, Goodyear Wingfoot Lighter Than Air Society became the National Lighter Than Air, correct? And then that became the Balloon Flyers of Akron.
Goodyear didn't want an employee activity flying gas balloons. So they suggested that a separate organization be formed to just for the purposes of flying. The Wingfoot group became the study organization, and National Light of the Nair, sort of a grandly named organization, became the flying component of that. And so we kept that name until the mid-1980s, and then we changed it to the Balloon Flyers of Akron, more reflecting our heritage.
Okay. Now, you mentioned some names before. Could you please share the achievements and legacies of balloonists and instructors at this club?
With Roger Walcott was kind of the spearhead of the group. He was an aeronautical engineer that worked in fabric engineering for Goodyear aircraft at the time. And he actually has a patent on the inflatable airplane. It's called the inflatable plane that Goodyear developed in the 50s. But Roger was a good teacher, promoted the sport, brought in other people that he knew would be good fits for this and as an aviator. And another was Art Swanson, who was a very, very experienced fixed wing pilot for Goodyear, the Goodyear organization, and also the Goodyear Wingfoot Flyers. They had an airplane club too. But Art was just an interesting guy from Chicago, sometimes cranky because I flew with Art and had the privilege of flying with Art. But Art was a hero, and during World War II, Art was working on a K ship, Navy airship. They were transporting it, I believe, you correct me, Bill, to the West Coast, and they had an onboard fire, a fire in the one of the engine gondolas, and Art and another guy on board personally crawled out onto that engine pod and put the fire out in the air to save the airship. It was millions of dollars, and it was part of the war effort. And he received one of the few awards given by Paul W. Litchfield to a Goodyear employee for that. And he was well recognized for that feat. And then Bill, I'll let you tell about Jimmy and the others.
So Jimmy Cantos was a scrappy little guy from Ohio, didn't have much money, but had this vision, this dream he wanted to fly. He would save up his pennies from his paper out, whatever he could get, and go out to the local airport. And for a penny a pound in those days, a kid could get a flight in an airplane. He decided he wanted to get licensed, and he'd actually dropped out of high school, I think. But he continued with his flying lessons and worked his way into various professional jobs, but never let go of the dream of flying any way he could do it, whether it's parachuting. He broke his back one time parachuting, or fixed wing flying, or of course, being in Akron, he saw blimps and he saw balloons in the air, and he wanted to do that. He was an early member of our club and pioneered a lot of ways of getting in the air. Jimmy developed the idea of a cluster balloon. So you could many weather balloons, string them together, inflated with hydrogen, and he'd take off and try to have enough of those to lift them off the ground. He only succeeded a few times, but he tried many times and got a lot of attention for it. The other thing Jimmy Cantos did was to develop what was probably the first recognized hot air balloon in the United States. He built a balloon of synthetic fabric in his garage with two other guys, and they used a salamander oven, which is like it's a sort of an industrial warming,
Like a torpedo heater.
And he put that in the basket that they constructed and built a trench and built this big fire, try to get the balloon inflated. And he actually took off once and made a short flight. He never followed through on that, never patented the idea, but he claimed to be the first. 6 years before, a guy named Ed Yost actually took off and made his first flight in a type certified modern hot air balloon. So the fourth guy was a very intellectual, strong-minded guy named Don Overs, who became very close to Mike and to me, who was an intellectual powerhouse. In his final professional career, he was a naval nuclear propulsion engineer for Westinghouse, installing power plants on aircraft carriers. He was a very intelligent guy, taciturn, stern, but easy to get along with. And he was our disciplinarian and our mentor and helped us restore the aircraft that we eventually flew. But those around those four guys, sort of the core of our club, other people would drift in and drift out, but those are the guys who we consider the heroes and the founders of our organization that really kept the thing alive for a long time.
Okay, we will come to Jimmy Cantos later, but I wanted to also check about activities that continued in the 60s and 70s in the club to keep alive the sport of gas ballooning. So what were some of these activities that led the balloon flyers of Akron, to become popular and to grow bigger in size?
Well, once these, we bought these Navy surplus gas balloons, and our guys got trained in them gradually through the good graces of the Goodyear blimp pilots and a couple other balloonists around the country who helped to get them trained. But then they wanted to build up their flying time and show their skills. So they would present themselves at county fairs or commercial events like for Ford or a tractor company or a farm show out west in the Midwest. And they'd actually do flights, sometimes tethered flights, sometimes free flights, just to show the people a balloon. The balloon was a very popular thing back then, not only because of Michael Todd's famous movie Around the World in 80 Days, but because a balloon was still a novelty also.
And Bill, also to mention, our club lost its inexpensive, almost free source of gas early on in the 50s, and that was coal gas. They used to fly from Republic Steel at a coke operation, so they got the gas for free. And then when that was no longer available, they had to transition to using compressed gases, hydrogen and helium, which were both equally expensive then as they are now. Helium's way more expensive now, but so that was the reason for they called them sponsored flights, or they would get a Chevrolet dealer was one of the sponsors, and they paid for the gas. I don't think the club made much, if anything, on it, but they got free gas. Hydrogen and helium was available to them.
Yeah, Mike's right. The early training flights were conducted at virtually no cost because the club had access to a Republic Steel plant in Massillon, Ohio. And all they had to do was hook up their inflation sleeve to the surplus gas flowing out of the steelmaking process. And the coke gas is a byproduct of steelmaking. 47% hydrogen, 32% methane, 6% carbon monoxide, and 15% nitrogen. It's very flammable. It smelled terrible, but it was cheap and it was perfect for ballooning. So these guys made about 40 flights for the first couple of years, 1956, 1957, just using the free gas from the surplus of Republic Steel. after that, like Mike said, we had to start getting sponsors for it, or sometimes members would pay for it themselves.
Now, coming to both of you, your interest in gas ballooning, both of you were in your early teens when you became members of the club. What was it about these balloon flights and the club that impacted you so much? I know you talked about it a lot, but how did it impact you in your early teens?
Bill, I'll go first.
Okay.
I've always been interested in anything that flew. I used to have flying dreams as a kid before I ever flew in anything, as many other aviators have. And I remembered I could see the Goodyear blimps and Navy airships in Akron. They were made here daily. We would see the airships flying over. We'd always hear them first and run outside and to look up and wave. And so it was a daily occurrence. And I wanted to be in one of those. I wanted to be part of that. And then an interesting thing happened to me on my way home from elementary school in I think it was 1963. I was walking with a friend, and we looked up in the sky and saw a round silver balloon. It said U.S. Navy on the side of it. And that was a 19,000 cubic foot balloon. And the reason it was appealed to me, my dad was in the Navy in World War II. He was in submarines, not in balloons or anything. But I thought, my dad's in the Navy, and that's a Navy balloon. And so it was a big deal for me. I was very young. I was six or 7 years old. But and it turns out later on, I find out that Don Overs, who trained us and signed me off for my license, that was his solo flight. Bill and I figured it out through records and flight logs that Don made his solo flight, and he flew over my school when I was walking home from elementary school. So that certainly had a big impact.
I guess the thing that drew me into ballooning in the first place is that I had an interest in photography and, of course, in aviation. This was the beginning of the space age in 1961, 62, when I became interested. I had access to some weather balloons and some free helium from a special supplier. And I sent up a series of experiments from my backyard in the suburb of Cleveland, carrying cameras, sometimes mice. And I had this vision that someday I could put together a bunch of these balloons and build a little cage or basket or something for myself and fly away. My parents began to think I was pretty serious about this, and they said, you can't do that until you find someone else who's done it. So my research then led me to the Wingfoot Light of the Nerve Society when I contacted Jimmy Cantos, who wrote back to me right away and started inviting me to club meetings and to witness some of the flights and participate in some of the work parties that the club was having. So that's what I did. And I became affiliated like almost 50 years ago or 60 years ago with that group, and been with them ever since.
Both of you dreamt of flying a gas balloon when you were in your early teens. You also paid your $1 per year membership fees for 20 years, but you had to wait for 15 years before you even got a chance to train. So what were the reasons for the delay?
Sitara, as youngsters, we had so much enthusiasm for lighter than air history. Just being around these guys were our heroes. We just wanted to be there. We wanted to help and be part of that history. And then we started to realize that the guys they were flying, making these epic flights. Both of us were in school at the time, so it made it difficult for us to go along with them. I'm sure we would have been invited, but it was a different time then. But it is important to include youngsters in this sport and get them involved, because they're the future. So Bill and I persevered as young men, and didn't matter if we didn't get to go or not. We knew someday we would be part of this flying activity, and we did. Bill, do you have anything to add to that?
Oh, that's about right. We went out and got our hot air balloon licenses and got our commercial rating in hot air balloons, which made it easier for the older members to accept us as legitimate pilots suitable for training in gas balloons. And we had all these resources we had acquired from the United States Navy as surplus equipment. And it was just sitting there. We'd go to work parties and help these guys mend the equipment and keep it ready for them to fly. So Mike and I picked one of those balloons and said, we're going to train and learn to fly on this one. So we get a pristine 19,000 cubic, very small training balloon. And we selected that from our whole inventory of about 12 gas balloons. And we made that sort of our own balloon to use and to ask our senior pilot, our senior aeronaut, Don Overs, to train us. So he agreed. He knew we were legitimate and we're serious. And we went ahead and cashed in our points, as it were, to get the training.
And nowadays you do help the youngsters train, right?
I certainly do. Yeah, any opportunity to take a young person, at least let them crew with us, go on the chase vehicle, and then if they show the enthusiasm that Bill and I did, I encourage them to continue on with their training. I take them for flights as long as they have parental permission, of course. But I feel it's very important for our sport. It's our sport is leveling, if not declining. And I think we can stop that by getting the youngsters involved.
Well, ballooning is a sport that wants to be shared also. It's a sort of a manpower intensive, labor intensive kind of endeavor. So we need friends to help us and get younger, able-bodied people to come in and lift the propane tanks and do any of the heavy lifting involved. Of course, we'll take their help and we'll give them a little reward along the way.
Yes, that's great. Okay, how were your gas balloon training flights? Were there any terrifying moments on these flights?
I wouldn't use the word terrifying in any of our flights.
Okay.
For this reason, we had good, strong leadership in the club who had learned discipline from the Navy and from Goodyear, which both had safe operations, and they trained us to be safe and to respect our equipment and to plan carefully. And so we were very fortunate that we had these guys to counsel us and mentor us along the way. And we had some adventures, but they were more distance adventures and fun things. But I don't remember anything terrifying. Mike, do you?
There's always variables in flying, especially long distance flying. And with the rudimentary tools we had, we did not have GPSs. We had a CB radio. Later on in our flying, we had a handheld aircraft radio, but we had very limited tools. Weather forecasting wasn't close to being what it is these days. You can go online and have live radar. We didn't have any of those resources. So we encountered weather a few times that we did not expect. Rain over West Virginia, we didn't know was coming. Makes the balloon a little heavier, so a good thing we had extra ballast. We got into some faster moving winds up in our first flight into Canada and had a windy landing. But as Bill mentioned, we were prepared for that. We were taught how to do windy landings. So that kind of thing. We did see lightning that was on our record flight, Bill.
Yeah, one of those overnight flights.
Yeah, up over
the
the lakes. And it turns out that in fact it was, but it was several hundred miles north up over Canada. And the light reflected off of the atmosphere, and we could see it, and it looked very real to us, especially hanging under a ball of 19,000 cubic feet of hydrogen.
Well, the other thing about that flight, Mike, when we saw the lightning, is that we were out there over Lake Erie, midway across Lake Erie at night in a 42-year-old Navy surplus gas balloon hanging by a cotton net in a wicker basket. And lightning is to the gas balloonist like water is to the Wicked Witch of the West. You know, you don't want to mix those two because the end result is not very good.
So it was concerning, but not terrifying.
Okay. Now, is there a requirement for an overnight flight if you have to get your gas balloon pilot license?
You can fly a hot air balloon overnight too.
Okay.
The only restriction or the only limiting factor there is how much fuel can you carry and how efficient is your envelope. So Richard Branson, Per Lindstrand, their flights across the Atlantic and Pacific were at night, and in daytime as well. But it's not nearly as easy as it is in a gas balloon.
Right.
We tried to
But
follow
to
the
get your
old.
license, do you have to do it, the overnight flight?
Well, we
You do
had
To
not.
get your pilot's license?
Not a requirement.
No.
not a requirement.
okay,
We
it's
tried
not
to
a-
follow the Navy syllabus, the Navy training syllabus that called for 6 hours of flying, averaging 2 hours each, including one overnight flight and one solo. So that's
Okay.
basically, we followed that as closely as we could. And so the night flight was always one of the highlights of a Navy balloonist training. And we were actually looking forward to that and made 3 or 4 night flights.
That's actually the most stable and best time to fly a gas balloon. You're not affected by the sun.
All right. Well, let's move now to the movie To Fly. To Fly was made for the National Air and Space Museum's IMAX theater. The museum opened in July 1976, and the movie was shown then. Even now, 42 years later, it is still shown daily at the theater. It has brought in $120 million. It begins with the ballooning sequence, and the story behind the filming of that sequence is interesting. Could you please share that story?
The To Fly movie was one of the brainstorms of Michael Collins, the Apollo 11 command pilot who flew around the moon. And he became the first director of the new National Air and Space Museum. He wanted something dramatic to put in the IMAX theater. So he commissioned the creation of this film about American aviation, starting with the most basic, going from the man's first form of flight, the balloon, to ever increasing size, fixed wing, heavier than aircraft. But so our club was invited to provide the balloon for that, and we dressed it up and decorated it a little bit, and got involved in two different seasons of the filming. The first was from a platform in Vermont where the ground scenes were filmed, but the weather was not good enough during that filming effort to fly. So they moved the whole flying sequence down to West Virginia the following spring, and all the flying sequences were filmed down there. And 4 of our members of our club were the pilots for that movie. They were hidden in the basket underneath a cloth, while the pilot, who was the actor, was waving and tossing confetti and giving his little poetry.
They flew over the Cheat River Valley, which is a very, very beautiful place. It actually looks like Vermont, but in West Virginia. And an interesting fact is I think Roger Walcott told me about this. They flew, it was beautiful weather for the whole weekend. And I'm not sure what day they took off, but they landed in the woods in a clearing, and then gathered up a bunch of rocks and logs and heavy things, put them in the basket. And it's called bagging down or bedding down the balloon overnight. And then they wound up getting a ride to a hotel or a local motel, went back the next morning, got in the balloon, and actually flew it longer. So they maximized, and that was a helium flight, so it was very expensive. But I thought that was very interesting that they were able to get 2 flights out of 1 inflation.
Well, the other interesting thing about that particular flight and the return, the second day, was that they landed in the same field from which they had taken off the day before. The weather system had changed completely from this direction back to this direction, and they landed back in the same place they took, which was almost unheard of, impossible to try to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And the actor who was there was Patrick Walker. Is that his name? Patrick?
I have to look up his name.
Okay. And
He
so he only did the ground
Walker.
scene.
Peter Walker.
Peter Walker, right. Okay.
He had
Peter
played,
Walker.
one of his starring roles, he was the Marlboro cigarette man, sort of a rugged looking guy.
Yes.
Commanding voice and convincing character. He didn't know anything about flying balloons. He never actually went up in the balloon. He was just at the top of a scaffold there being filmed.
The stand-in for him was a club member named Kurt Staling. And he dressed up as that gentleman.
The 1831 aeronaut took off there.
And Kurt Staling was a real German rocket scientist in World War II. And he was one of our club members.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned about James Cantos before.
Mhm.
And I see that you do have a lot of coverage in your book for James Cantos, who was also one of the founders of the Wingfoot Lighter Than Air Society. He joined Goodyear Aircraft in 1940. Would you say that he did some pioneering work in reviving the Rosier balloon?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Jimmy decided, and that was during the Free Life project, that his idea came to fruition. Is that correct, Bill?
Yes, it was an attempt. He was invited to fly the prototype balloon for a transatlantic flight in it was going to take off in 1970, but he added some ideas to the basic balloon. And that was to create a pocket of air under the gas bag, and he could heat that pocket of air under the gas bag and offset the night contraction you get in a normal gas balloon flight. So he would heat the balloon at night to cause it to maintain equilibrium. And by that, using that method, he thought he could make a flight of at least 2,000 miles over land in this prototype. And he borrowed some parts from Goodyear to try to do that. So he actually flew with that prototype balloon, didn't get very far for a lot of other complicating reasons. The bag tore at takeoff and the other complications he had. But it was a sort of a proof of concept that this idea would work. And then it was emulated on the actual flight across the Atlantic, the attempt across the Atlantic. Unfortunately, the burner on that one failed shortly after takeoff, and the 3 people aboard perished. But the idea was a sound one if it were to be executed properly, and it was subsequently adopted by a guy named Don Cameron and a number of transatlantic balloon flights in the years to come. But Jimmy was a pioneer in developing the modern Rosier balloon.
So for 4 years, James Cantos, or Jimmy Cantos as he was known, tried to ascend using a cluster of balloons at least 12 times. He succeeded on 12 September 1959 when he rose to more than 10,000 feet. But he had some terrifying moments. Could you please explain what happened on that flight and how did he get to the ground?
To valve or to release gas from a cluster balloon, you have to release the balloons one at a time, or how many you deem necessary. And the only way to do that is to either you carry a pellet gun, which Jimmy did, and shoot an air pistol at one of the balloons to break it, or release balloons by cutting one of the suspension cords, which are parachute cord. So Jimmy, I think he was able to puncture some balloons with the pistol, but then lost hold of it. And then to release, he thought, okay, I've got another plan here, so I can release balloons with the parachute cord. And instead of going up and away, they snarled around the other balloons. So he had a challenging time to get rid of gas. He eventually got rid of enough balloons to make it come down, but it's kind of a coarse way to control a gas balloon.
If you go high enough, those balloons will pop on their own accord. And he did descend after reaching, what, 10 or 12,000 feet.
He was high, and he did not have oxygen either.
But again, he was a gutsy, scrappy pioneer who got himself in the air and got an awful lot of publicity for what he was trying to do. He was very good at that. I think he nurtured all the reporters in the Akron area to pay attention to him.
If I recall correctly, I think I read that he had not tried the air pistol on ground, popping those balloons. He didn't use it on the ground to shoot at the balloons in the book.
I don't recall, Bill, do you?
Okay.
I'm not sure what that refers to. I know he did try to shoot the pellet gun at some of the balloons, and a few of the pellets just bounced off the balloons because they weren't taut yet. They were sort of flaccid balloons and didn't puncture them. So he was imperiled somehow as he tried to conduct himself on this flight, but he survived, and he lived to tell about it many, many times.
Yeah.
He flew with, he always had a parachute with him too. And this was a streamered out parachute attached with a brake cord from his chair gondola. So if he had to, he could have released from that and probably survived with that parachute. Another thing Jim was famous for was he always seemed to have an inner tube, an inflated car inner tube or truck inner tube underneath his gondolas with the N number, the registration number of the aircraft painted on it. And then he told me, he says, so it's a landing cushion bag. If I hit hard, it's going to give me some shock absorbing. Or if I land in the water, I've got a built-in life preserver. So his rigs seemed kind of comical, but the concept was a sound one.
Yeah, a real daredevil.
Because he was a daredevil, but he didn't have the financial resources to fully develop his idea with the best kind of equipment. So he borrowed and begged what he could to put together the right idea, the right concept there. And he pioneered a lot of stuff, and we have to give him credit for his innovative thought and his courage in doing this stuff.
Yes. Yes.
He's a
Now,
character.
sorry, go ahead.
He was a character.
In the early 70s, crossing the Atlantic by balloon became the aeronautical attraction for many balloonists. And Thomas Gatt Jr. from Virginia had a novel and scientific solution: fly above the weather to cross the Atlantic. And he took off on February 18, 1974, under a cluster of 10 super pressure balloons called Light Heart. Bill, you knew Tom and you were communicating with him as well as handling media relations. So the mystery and tragic end to his flight haunted you. Would you like to share some of Tom's flight details and your own experience?
Sure. I met Tom Gatch in Albuquerque at the first World Hot Air Balloon Championship in 1973, and we discovered that we lived near one another in the Washington, D.C. area at the time. And he eventually confided to me what his big plan was: learning to fly a balloon so he could fly one across the Atlantic Ocean, which was it was sort of the golden era of long distance ballooning at the time. People were trying to go farther and farther, and especially the Atlantic attracted a lot of attempts. Tom had a different idea. Rather than the low level flights that had failed, low level meaning under 10,000 feet and flying with the weather, Tom wanted to fly above the weather. So as you said, Sitara, he contracted for the construction of 10 super pressure, constant pressure, helium-filled balloons, partially inflated on the ground. So when you get to altitude, they're fully inflated. And he was going to fly at 36. He did fly at 36,000 feet. Asked me to be his communications director and publicist. So I did all that, and we got a lot of attention for him. And he succeeded in flying about 1,800 miles across the Atlantic Ocean by himself at that altitude, talking to commercial airliners as they passed by. But then all communication stopped, and we don't know really what happened to him. One ship 2 days later did spot what looked like his balloon cluster drifting not too far above the water, but no contact was made with him, and everything about Tom Gatch completely disappeared. He just vanished in the mid-Atlantic. So that kind of left me with a sad story to tell. And I had to communicate that gradually to the media, because we never quite gave up hope until you find something, but there was nothing to find ever. He just disappeared halfway across the Atlantic. But I had flown with Tom in hot air balloons. He signed my logbook. He helped to train me in hot air balloons. So it was a loss for me personally. And I write a lot about that in a book I did about that flight and another expedition that Mike and I were involved in.
Yes. What is the name of the book in which you wrote about this flight?
That book is called Just Wind.
Just Wind. Okay.
Just Wind. It's still available.
Okay. It's available on Amazon?
It is.
Just Wind? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
That talks about the transatlantic flight and also a global circumnavigation attempt that Mike and I were involved with.
I enjoyed reading about your gas balloon flight from Akron to Canada. You flew over Lake Erie and even Lake Ontario, and you were not able to contact anyone in Canada to enter their airspace. So if you could just describe this flight, and also how is it different flying over land and over a large expanse of water at night?
Goodbye.
Flying over water is more stable than flying over land because there's residual heat, an uneven heating of the earth that can still give you some effects at night. But it's very stable, and we stayed right around 5,000, 5,500 feet most of the flight. It was very comfortable. It got cold and damp, but not sub-zero or anything like that. But we were prepared to talk to air traffic control. We actually did on the state side. We talked to a couple of towers, and our radio worked. But it was when handheld radio, aircraft radios first came out in the 80s. They're of limited power. And as it got cold, maybe our batteries got cold and our transmitting power wasn't strong enough, but we could not reach any ATC facility. We tried numerous times. So there's no way to land. We couldn't land in Lake Ontario at night. So we just kept on flying, and we knew we were going fast and we would exit their airspace soon. And our plan was, and has been in the past, if we saw an aircraft coming towards us, we had position lights, but most airplane pilots don't know what balloon night position lights look like. You can ask anyone and they have no idea. But so we had a 1,000,000 candle power landing light. So we were going to flash that up at the envelope and then out into the sky a little bit to let them know there is something there, and hopefully they would turn away.
Fortunately, we did not see any other aircraft approaching us. Nobody encroached on our space, but we had a really remarkable experience flying not only across Lake Erie and trying to communicate with people in Canada on the ground with our CB radio in particular. Nobody believed we were a balloon flying overhead. But that night we flew right over downtown Toronto about 2:00 in the morning, and the whole city was lit up spectacularly. It's one of the most beautiful sights we have seen from a balloon, I think. Just paralleling Lake Ontario on the Canadian side. And early in the morning, we began encountering some overcast and some fog, and the weather began kind of closing in. So we decided to bring the balloon down and land. And we realized how fast we were going, about 35 miles an hour as we were coming down, stepping our altitude down slowly. And we touched down in this small field about 40 miles, or was this 40 miles north of?
We were about 40 miles from Ottawa.
Ottawa, yeah. And we deflated the balloon there. And as we were working on it, some guy with a couple of teeth, a skinny guy, came out, an older guy, and he just said, "Hey, what are you doing there? Good. When you're done here, come up into the house."
Okay.
He didn't know if we were in trouble or what, but
He just looked like a poor farmer.
Yeah, he was a poor farmer.
And we were hoping he'd help us pack up, because it's hard. Two guys packing up a gas balloon is difficult, but we did. We went up to his home.
And he lived there in this poor little house with his sister. And when we got into the house, they'd made breakfast for us. They made toast and bananas and tea, and they welcomed us. They wanted to hear our story. And then he told us a story about his brother.
And he had a small photo up on the wall with a certificate, and his brother flew, and I think his brother was killed in the Battle of Britain, flying a Spitfire for the British Air Force.
But we made a friend in Canada that day. We trespassed on this guy's land, and he was the most gracious landowner just to welcome us there. Two guys dropping in out of the sky from almost 500 miles away, and he just gave us a wonderful welcome. And then we gave him $20, and he drove us into the nearest town, where we called Canadian Customs, and they came over and gave us the right paperwork to get our balloon back into the States.
And they were very nice too, but that was long before 9/11.
Yeah. Yeah.
How often can you slip into a country unnoticed and receive that kind of a welcome?
Yes, I know. It's good that they were friendly. Now, in the early 90s, both of you were invited to help with the Earth Winds Balloon project, which was going to be a trans-world flight. And I see that there were many disconcerting factors that came into play during the preparations. And Mike, you were also invited as a crew member.
Mhm.
Could you please describe that experience and what you were thinking and feeling through all that?
I started to volunteer at the invitation of a Goodyear employee here in Akron when Larry Newman and Don and Vladimir came to Akron, and the aircraft was not ready to fly when they arrived here. There was a lot of things that needed done. So I went out every day after I worked for the Akron Fire Department, and every day off duty I was out there helping them. But so I became friends with all of them, and we would go out together and eat together and spend our days together. And Larry Newman liked the work that I was doing, safety conscious. I had some valuable skills. I was a paramedic instructor, firefighter, and lots of balloon experience at that time, and a gas pilot. So then we never got the weather in Akron at the air dock. It was just always windy. The Lake Erie wasn't frozen. The winds were always coming off the lake. So then the project moved out west. They were going to go to Tillamook, Oregon, and then they wound up settling in at Stead Field in Reno, Nevada, at the invitation of Baron Hilton. But one of the things about the project is it just became very large. There were lots of people involved. There's a lot of money involved.
Well, we had some really big names involved in the project too. Larry Newman, who founded this thing, was part of the crew that was the first to fly across the Atlantic and the first to fly across the Pacific. Richard Branson had invested a lot of money in this flight. He was going to fly initially with them. And the third member of the crew was a Soviet cosmonaut named Vladimir Zhenebekov, who had spent 58 days in space, saving one of the Soviet space stations, Salyut 7. So we had some very high-level people, and then Baron Hilton, as Mike said, the hotel magnate, put a lot of money into this too. So there's a lot of firepower behind this effort. Go ahead in the Reno flights, Mike.
But then the project moved to Reno, and Bill and I both went out on our own money to help them. They were invited out. They gave us a room and meals and so forth. So we went out to help them continue the project out there. But they were met with the first accident. I'm going to call it an accident. First off-field landing. Just things on the aircraft didn't work. Some of the control systems. And Bill, the Hallelujah, was it Hallelujah Junction?
Hallelujah Junction, or a mountaintop in the Sierra Nevada mountain, just on the California side, where the balloon scraped because it couldn't gain altitude fast enough.
Temperature inversion kept the balloon from penetrating it. It was a very strong inversion, so they couldn't get through it. So that's when they essentially slammed into the mountain. And the quick release system was electronic squibs that fired like an explosive bolt. And they fired, and they went through part of the cable. So they were lucky they were not killed on that flight. It didn't sever the cable all the way, and they wound up landing on that mountain and were rescued.
Well, they made 2 other flights after that, also from Reno, but both of those went in the wrong direction and didn't weren't in the air for more than a few hours. So
the flight I was invited to fly on, I was given about 3 days notice. I was here in Akron, sitting in my house, and Richard Abruzzo had backed out. So Larry called me and said, "How would you like to go?" So, and that's a lot on your plate, at Christmas time, and thinking all of a sudden, here we go, I'm going to go fly around the world, or try. I knew a lot about the capsule because I worked on it a lot here in Akron, and how the system worked, and I felt pretty comfortable with that. But once I got to Reno, we had some limited training on it. Things had changed dramatically since it was worked on in Akron. It was I felt way overweight. The gondola was extremely heavy. It was no longer supported by the Rutans at Scale Composites. They want to know part of it. Raven Industries really want to know part of this. Just lots of changes, lots of crew changes, people in, now they're out. I just started getting very uncomfortable about it. I knew better. I analyzed it. I made many phone calls to Bill, also to Don Overs at home, who left the project. He was kind of mistreated, I feel, but he left while it was still here in Akron. And I asked Don what he thought, and he asked me to send him any information I could. And I said, well, here's the size of the anchor balloon, the venting capability, this and this, and all sorts of technical details that are in Bill's book. But and Don suggested to keep your parachute on. He says, because you might need it. And so that was enough for me. And I thanked him for the opportunity. You know, it was not a personal thing against Larry or Dave Melton or anyone else. Everyone treated me well out there. I just didn't feel that it was safe for me to go.
Well, for the first 2 years of that project, I was the publicist. I was the publicity director for that. And we got a lot of attention because it's a pretty dramatic thing when you inflate these balloons inside the Goodyear Zeppelin air dock in Akron and then bring them out for the public to see and try to fly them from there, and then try to fly them from a big public place like Stead Air Force Base in Reno, Nevada. So we got a lot of press attention, but the pilots couldn't deliver on the flight performance, and the aircraft really wasn't ready to fly at any time for around the world. But we got an awful lot of press for the Hilton organization, which I think is what they wanted, and for Richard Branson at Virgin, which is what he wanted. And fortunately, nobody got killed.
Yeah, twice they launched in 1994, right, and spent $8 million on this.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So,
They're very, very capable of blowing through a lot of money on this.
Mike, what is the longest distance that you have flown?
Sitara, I was privileged to fly in the America's Challenge gas balloon race out of Albuquerque, New Mexico in 2017. I'd flown it 2 times before that, but a fellow named Phil Bryant invited me to come along with him, and we flew his balloon from Albuquerque and landed in Lyons, Indiana, which was an 1,103-mile flight, taking 44 hours. It was essentially camping in the air. We got to know each other very, very well. Lots of stories, lots of time to talk, and lots of time to see the great United States from Albuquerque to Indiana. So that was one of my epic flights, one of my top, if not the top flight in my ballooning career.
And if I recall, you won that race, right?
No, we were third place, the U.S.
Okay.
teams. So we qualified for the Gordon Bennett with
Okay.
that flight.
Okay. Bill, what is the longest distance that you have flown?
Star, I was very fortunate to be able to have these long flights with Mike as we went through our training program. I flew for 10 hours with him. We flew for 14 hours together. We flew for 17 hours together, the longest of which was 515 miles on a flight from Akron, Ohio to a suburb of Boston, Massachusetts. And all these were overnight flights, which is the most smooth and beautiful way to fly over the terrain at night to see the sparkling lights out there. Just magical, as I said earlier. But the longest of my flights was 500 miles, the other couple of 400-mile legs with Mike.
It was in 1985.
Yes.
You covered 515 miles in 17 hours and 5 minutes. And that was impressive. Can you tell us about that experience? That was in 1985, and I believe communications equipment, you didn't have what it is now, right?
No, not at all.
After we made our Canadian flight, we knew that we were capable of making a long distance flight, and we looked up the distance records that were then existing. Said, well, here's one that we can get. So the record that we broke had been set in 1927 by a Navy pilot flying out of Lakehurst, New Jersey, and he landed way up in Canada someplace. But we exceeded his record by going 515 miles from Akron Municipal Airport to a golf course in the suburb of Boston, Massachusetts. And we had a guy and his wife who was chasing us in their car. They were with us the entire way across the upper tier of New York State and all the way across Massachusetts. So it was a remarkable experience. And we did set the record and got recognized for that. Well, that sort of was the trigger for a series of other flights that we were able to make. when we were given our certificate of record at the National Air and Space Museum, the guy who presented it to us was an active duty Navy Vice Admiral, who was the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Air Warfare. And he asked a lot of questions about our balloon and what we could do with it. Then he invited us to fly in the 75th anniversary of naval aviation out of Pensacola, Florida. So we made a flight there. We made a postal commemorative flight carrying balloon mail, also for the Navy. And then the Air Force invited us to fly for their 40th anniversary out
Wow.
of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
Right off the front lawn of the museum for the 40th anniversary. It was just amazing.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
But by getting the right kind of connections and right kind of people behind us, with all those flights were sponsored. After our record flight, where we paid for our own gas, everything after that, we had people paying for our gas for us because they knew that we were serious and we were capable and we were going to do the right thing and be careful.
And it was in the club tradition.
Right.
To fly sponsored.
Right.
So that's good that it led to some special honors for both of you.
Mhm.
Some recognition there. So how is the gas ballooning scene now in the US and around the world?
It is coming back again. The American gas balloonists traditionally like their own equipment. They're not club oriented as we were back in the 50s and 60s. That the club concept went away. The Europeans have always had it, the Germans especially. They have large gas balloon clubs over there, and everybody flies a lot cheaper than we do, but plus they have cheaper hydrogen in Germany.
And
So
isn't it easy over there for them to get the hydrogen?
it is very easy.
Right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Willie Eimers has a hydrogen pipe right to his farm that goes under the roads, and then they have a meter on it and they charge them accordingly. And we call it inexpensive compared to what we pay here. But the club concept, Bert Padel and Sam Parks decided that we should try it here. And then I was number 3 into that organization. So once we got 5, we put some money together. We wanted 10 members, 10 founding members. So put our money together, and then Bert bought the materials and built a training balloon of 24,000 cubic feet that is hydrogen certified. It's built similar to the German balloons. And it's based in Statesville, North Carolina. It's called the Aero Club of America. And so we're not as active as we want to be because of trying to get gas and the lead time to purchase gas here. They want a week notice sometimes. And it's hard to deliver on weather. You can say, especially this time of the year, you could have bad weather, and that once the gas is sitting there, it's yours. You just bought it. So if the weather is bad, and then there's rental fees on the tanks, there's lots of things that are create a hardship. So you want to make sure you go on your first available window. But we are trying, and that is also my understanding. I heard recently that there's 2 other groups, one out west and then another southeast group that are looking into purchasing their own club balloon, gas balloon. So that'd be great if we had 3 in the United States. It'd be really wonderful. So, but we're trying, and we are flying. We fly about 2 or 3 times a year.
Okay. Now, just a couple of more questions. What were some challenges in writing this book?
Well, Mike and I have been friends for 45 years. And so we communicate back and forth a lot anyway. And one of his concerns was that our club was not getting any attention whatsoever in the history books or anything. And maybe we should try to get a Wikipedia page together. So we began collecting notes and comparing. This is about the same time that the coronavirus began hitting, and we couldn't get together physically to write. So we just began sending things back and forth to each other, getting old diaries or stuff from deceased members' collections, or looking in the archives or the Light of the Air Society or old newspapers, and just reconstructing the life experiences of these members who created our club and kept it going. But the challenge was sort of knowing when to stop, because there's so much material
Yes.
about these flights and about the people who did this work. And we conferred at about 1,700 hours every night with a beer in our hands, back and forth, and just try to figure out what we should include, what we should try to discover, what we did not know. And we met a lot of additional people in the course of the research for this book. But it was a great teamwork to put this together.
And we just kept turning over new leaves every week.
Yes.
And
It was a lot of work.
I've been told by some senior balloonists, and I said, we had more and more stories. We could have kept going. And they said, why didn't you keep going? Because then it would have been 500 pages. So
Maybe another one.
Maybe, we'll see.
And finally, would you like to add anything more?
Well, I'll say this, as you maybe can gather from our conversation so far, gas ballooning is not really for the faint of heart or for the thin of wallet. This is a sport that requires substantial research and planning for every flight, requires a lot of financial resources, some expensive capital equipment, and of course, a dedicated support team. And I might add also a great deal of luck. Now, Mike and I have been very lucky, and our mentors were careful and lucky. And that's one of the reasons we were able to do what we did with our flights. And that's why we wanted to share their achievements in our book.
Mike, would you like to add anything?
To address some of the issues that Bill brought up in current gas ballooning, we have implemented the club concept here in the United States that Germany and Europe has been using for years. Americans are resistant to group ownership of aircraft, it seems. So we have started a club in North Carolina. It's called the Aero Club of America, North Carolina chapter. 10 of us went together to buy a training gas balloon. And it eliminates some of the issues of expense. To buy a very expensive balloon, we split it 10 ways. We split the gas amongst the members who fly on a flight by the amount of hours that they fly. So it makes it way more affordable. And then also we have built-in crew, members that we try and get everybody to come out. That's not always possible. But when they do come out, we have additional members for chase crew, for filling sandbags. And then we do additional hops so others can get maybe a short ride for an hour or two in a gas balloon. And then we split the expenses amongst all those who flew. And it makes it a lot more fun.
Between flights, you have to deflate it, or?
No, you land if you have calm conditions like they did in West Virginia for the To Fly movie. If you can land and do a stand-up landing like you do with a hot air balloon, have some people hold it down, put some extra sandbags in, switch passengers, and then they take off again. And that would occur after sunrise in the morning. So it's going to be a shorter flight, a couple hours maybe.
But as a rule of thumb, after every flight, the gas balloon is completely deflated. You vent off, $1,000 worth of helium or $1,000 worth of hydrogen. It's gone. I mean, so you get a longer flight over a greater distance in a gas balloon than you do in a hot air balloon, but you pay more for it. And it's a greater, the beauty of flying in a gas balloon is it's absolutely quiet. We could stand just this far apart and whisper and be easily heard and hear the dogs barking on the ground, hear every horn or train whistle or boat in the water, anything that's out there, because it's absolutely silent. Whereas with the hot air balloon, you get the roaring of the burner and people tend to talk louder in a hot air balloon. And the flights are shorter. So it's not quite the same kind of experience emotionally or metaphysically.
So the beautiful flights, they do make it worth all the trouble and the expense that you go through.
We think so.
Okay. Thanks to both of you for sharing some stories from your book, Hands Off, and for your insights into the revival of gas ballooning in America. I wish you both many more safe and happy balloon flights and landings, and all the best.
Thank you, Sitara.
Thank you, Sitara. It was our pleasure to be here.
For stories and discoveries from the exciting and adventurous world of lighter-than-air aviation,